She arrived quietly, dressed with grace, a calm smile hiding years of struggle. To her son and his elegant girlfriend, it was just dinner. To her, it was the final test of dignity. At the restaurant, laughter flowed easily from their table. He bragged about business deals, she flaunted her designer dress, and between the clinking of wine glasses, every word they said carried the same message. You're not one of us anymore. They thought she was just an aging mother, clinging to memories of better times. What they didn't know was that she owned the very place they were sitting in. When her son mocked her simple shoes and her modest tone, the waiter approached, not to take her order, but to escort her to her private dining room. The room where chefs waited for her approval. The kitchen that ran because she built it from nothing. The silence at the table was deafening. Her son froze, realizing too late that the woman he had pitied had built an empire while he was busy chasing status. Years earlier, after losing her husband and being told she would never stand on her own again, she sold her jewelry, took night classes, and learned every detail of the restaurant business, from scrubbing floors to managing profits. Now, she stood in the same space where she had once served others, as the owner. When he finally whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him and replied calmly, "Because I didn't need your permission to start over." That night, under the warm lights of her restaurant, Carmen proved that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply owns the room in silence. When Daniel called, his voice sounded bright, quick, like a real estate agent rehearsing his pitch. Dinner at the Palm on Thursday night. Sophie's organizing it. Some partners are in town. Thought you might like to come. I paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to mistake it for a bad connection. You still like seafood, right? He added, as if our last meal together hadn't been through a drive-through window on a rushed moving day 15 months ago. I said yes, of course. That word had always come easily to him, and to me. After hanging up, I stared at the phone for a moment, wondering what had changed. Not enough to deserve warmth, but just enough to require my presence. I learned long ago that with Daniel, every invitation came lacquered in pretense. He didn't invite me as a mother. He positioned me. That Thursday, the weather turned cold despite the forecast. I pulled out a charcoal gray dress I hadn't worn since a charity event at the museum last spring. Modest, elegant, with a neckline that suggested effort but not extravagance. My real pearls, understated and cool, rested against my skin as I clasped them. In the mirror, I smoothed the sides of my hair, pinning them with quiet precision. I looked like myself, or at least like the version I still allowed the world to see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't about me. It was about filling a space. A mother for appearance's sake, a seat for balance. I put on my coat, slipped the invitation into my purse and walked out the door. Not with excitement, but with the firm grace of someone long accustomed to entering rooms where her worth is weighed before her name is spoken. By the time I reached the restaurant, I was 15 minutes early. Just enough to feel invisible. The stool at the bar gave me a view of the dining room without being too obvious. The Palm was the picture of restraint, dark green velvet seats, dim lighting that offered warmth instead of glare. I let my eyes wander, half listening to the soft jazz from the speakers, my fingers wrapped around a glass of still water. 15 minutes later I saw them. Daniel in a slate gray suit, no tie, phone still in hand as he walked. Sophie, radiant as ever, wrapped in ivory silk and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my first car. Two men flanked them, both in business casual attire, talking too loudly and laughing at their own jokes before finishing them. Daniel spotted me and cut his sentence in half. "Mom," he called, approaching with open arms but no real intention of hugging me. "You made it. So brave, wearing last season's loafers downtown. Bold choice." I glanced at my shoes. Simple black pumps, polished, discreet. "Comfortable," I said. "That's still legal." He smirked, as if I'd just confirmed his point. Sophie kissed the air beside my cheek. "Caroline, you look so classic, like Guadalajara in the 80s. Timeless." "Good to see you, Sophie," I replied. We were led to a table for 6 near the garden windows. The men introduced themselves as Stephen and Lawrence, both in real estate development, apparently blessed with an endless flow of metaphors about property values. Menus arrived along with the first round of conversation about expensive wines. Daniel ordered a Pinot with a wink at the sommelier. "She's a retired literature teacher," he joked, pointing toward me. "She knows words, not wines." I smiled politely. Good thing the two aren't mutually exclusive. They barely heard me. Lawrence was already telling a story about a condominium project in Querétaro, while Sophie scrolled through her phone to show a rooftop view she described as tragically misdesigned. The waiter refilled my water. Thanked him. No one noticed. I held the menu, nodded at the appropriate moments for the next 10 minutes, and spoke fewer than a dozen words. But I saw Mark pass through the main dining room twice. The second time he looked straight at me. "Not yet," I told him silently. The waiter returned with the wine, the second most expensive on the list, of course. Daniel made a little show of swirling it in his glass before nodding his approval like a judge on a cooking show. "Notes of cherry, oak, and just a touch of knowing the right people," he said, smiling at Stephen and Lawrence, who laughed immediately. Sophie took over, launching into a 10-minute monologue about a vineyard in Valle de Guadalupe, where, according to her, the owner's dog had its own Instagram account. She described the private tasting as if it were a birthright, then flowed effortlessly into the challenges of sourcing ethical caviar for an upcoming fundraiser. Mark passed again, steady, composed as always. Our eyes met for an instant. This time I shook my head slightly. "Not yet." His nod was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. He understood. The first course arrived. Black-eyed pea croquettes on a bed of charred onion aioli. I picked one up delicately and took a bite. Warm, crisp, carefully seasoned. "They're excellent," I said aloud. "Just the right touch of spice. Someone in that kitchen really cares." Daniel didn't look up from his phone. That's a bold palate for someone who microwaved Salisbury steak 4 nights a week. The others laughed politely, unsure how loud they were allowed to. I took a sip of wine, letting the burn coat my throat before swallowing. "Well," I said, folding my napkin carefully. "Growth is always possible. Even in the frozen food aisle." Sophie glanced at her phone, nudged Daniel, and showed him the screen. An ad from a fast fashion brand featuring an older woman in a tunic much like mine. The headline read, "Style on a budget." I caught the smug curve of her smile. Instead, I turned to the waiter and asked if the kitchen used grapeseed oil in the aioli. He blinked, surprised by the question, then nodded. "Lovely," I said, turning back to the table just as the second course arrived. The next dish was a delicate risotto with braised leeks and shaved fennel. Subtle, confident. I ate it slowly, grateful for the distraction. Daniel reclaimed the spotlight, summarizing a business seminar he'd attended in Cancun. "They brought in some real heavy hitters," he said between bites. "Market theory, wealth projections. Mom, you would have loved it. They even had a special online component for people without income streams." He laughed at his own joke. I set my fork down gently, resisting the urge to respond. I'd learned long ago that some barbs dull faster if you ignore them. Trying to shift the topic, I asked how construction was going in Polanco, the one I'd read about in the local paper. Daniel blinked once, then smiled, as if I'd just mentioned the wrong child at a family reunion. "Let's not bore the table with details," he said smoothly. "This isn't Sunday pozole." There was a pause. Even Lawrence didn't laugh that time. Across the dining room, Mark appeared again, gliding past the table like time itself. Eyes met. This time, I gave a small but unmistakable nod. He kept walking, but the tone of the night had changed. The third course came and went. No one commented on the roasted duck, though it was perfectly prepared. Sophie began scrolling through her phone again, leaning occasionally toward Daniel to whisper something in his ear, with that practiced intimacy that somehow still excluded everyone else at the table. When the dessert menus arrived, Sophie tilted her head slightly, with something resembling compassion, though it never reached her eyes. "You know," she said, "it's really sweet that you came. I'm glad you got to try a place like this." I folded my menu. I've always had a taste for warm spaces, I replied. Especially when the company is cold. She blinked. Daniel reached for his wine. Mark reappeared at my side just then, discreetly removing an empty plate. "When you're ready, ma'am," he said softly. "I am," I answered, standing up with practiced ease just as the fourth course began to arrive at the table. I glanced at the dessert options, letting my eyes rest on the Meyer lemon semifreddo. "I've had that one before," I said casually. "It's excellent. The kitchen balances the citrus with a rosemary syrup that's incredibly precise." Daniel let out a sharp laugh. "You've had it before. Mom, you can barely afford parking downtown." No one corrected him. The table burst into light chuckles. Even Sophie offered a tight smile before adding her own remark. "Come on, Daniel, let her dream." I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the warm pressure of my grandmother's ring against my palm, one of the few things I'd kept from my old life, worn tonight without ceremony. I didn't flinch. I just let their words hang in the air. Mark approached again with a new bottle, setting it down with his usual elegance. His eyes meeting mine for only a second, waiting for my cue. "Unless," Daniel said, swirling the last of his wine, "you're dating a millionaire. That's the only way you could afford this place." The laughter that followed was weaker this time. Even Stephen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I reached for my napkin and placed it on the table with a smooth, deliberate fold. My pulse was steady, not from restraint anymore, but from resolve. "I'm not dating anyone," I said calmly, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. "And I assure you my presence here doesn't rely on anyone else's wallet." Mark now stood right behind Daniel's chair. Serene posture, steady eyes, one hand lightly resting on the chair's back, waiting. Daniel snorted once, clearly dismissive. "Well then," he said, raising his glass, "let's toast to creative financing." I didn't raise mine. Instead, I turned slightly toward Mark and said, "Whenever you're ready." He inclined his head softly. "Of course, Miss Caroline," he said. "Your private room is ready. I'll escort you now." Mark cleared his throat gently. "Welcome back, Miss Caroline," he added, his voice smooth as ever. "Your private room is prepared. I'll let Chef Danielle know you'll be meeting her after her appointment with the investors." Daniel froze halfway through pouring his wine. Sophie's spoon slipped from her fingers, clinking against the plate. One of the partners made a small involuntary sound. Half gasp, half question. Mark didn't blink. "Would you like to continue the wine tasting in the cellar or begin in the garden room, ma'am?" The silence at the table was immediate and total. The weight of realization settled like sudden pressure in the air, and every pair of eyes turned toward me. I stood slowly, adjusting the sleeve of my dress with steady fingers. "I think I'll start in the garden," I said. "Please add their drinks to the main account." Daniel's expression twisted into something unfamiliar. Half confusion, half calculation. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. I turned to him, my voice clear and calm. "Enjoy the rest of your dinner. It's on the house, as always." I walked away from the table just as the waiter returned with the semifreddo, the plates trembling slightly in his hands. As I passed, I could feel their eyes clinging to my back like fog. Daniel's disbelief, Sophie's stunned silence, the growing recognition of the partners. But none of it reached me. Mark opened the side door near the wine wall and gestured with a subtle bow. As I crossed through the restaurant's buzz, it faded behind me. The hallway beyond was quieter, cooler, lined with framed photographs from the early days. Soft openings, handwritten menus, the faces of cooks who were no longer there. I stopped at a black-and-white photo of me and Chef Danielle laughing over a burnt cake during our first test dinner. Mark walked ahead and I followed, not with the nerves I once carried entering every room, but with the composure of someone finally stepping through a door she built herself. Danielle greeted me with a smile before I'd even crossed the threshold. "There you are," she said, giving me a firm, familiar hug that smelled faintly of saffron and citrus zest. "Quite the entrance." She poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon, the one we saved for long nights and well-earned victories. The room was warm with laughter. Mirabelle was updating the board with clippings from recent press coverage, and Cesar was reviewing the first proofs of a magazine feature scheduled for next week. "Cover story again," he said, raising an eyebrow. This time with a highlighted quote. I sat down, letting the glass warm in my hand. The clink of ice was comforting. The taste, when I took a sip, settled beneath my ribs like a memory. Years ago, after John died, I pawned my wedding ring at a small shop that still used paper receipts and a manual cash register. I never told Daniel. He was too busy buying apartments and suggesting I rent out the spare room to keep up with inflation. What I didn't tell him was that I had already started a hospitality course, that I was already walking to night classes in borrowed heels, already tracing the quiet outlines of something new. I used John's life insurance, what little was left after the medical bills, to invest in this place before it even had a name. I waited tables, scrubbed grout, learned profit and loss sheets from scratch. Here I found something I'd never had space for before, the chance to be the architect of my second act. There was a soft knock at the back door. Mark stood there, hands behind his back. "Miss Caroline, your son is outside the office. He's asked to speak with you." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward me. Danielle said nothing, just slid my glass a few inches closer. I stood, straightened my shoulders, and nodded to Mark. "Let him in," I said. "Let's hear how he sounds when he's not the one running the room." Daniel entered like a man walking into a courtroom, unsure if he was the defendant or the witness. His eyes swept over the private room, the bourbon on the table, the quiet confidence with which I sat, the framed press clippings on the back wall he had clearly never seen. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You should have told me. I wouldn't have made those jokes if I'd known." I raised a hand. "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You'd have held back your cruelty only if you thought I'd earned your respect through money, not through worth." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I worked in the coat room here the year before this place opened. I did payroll by hand in a borrowed office space. I slept on a fold-out couch with a broken hinge while you sent me apartment listings you thought I might like, if I ever got back on my feet. Mom, I tried. But I shook my head. You never once asked if I was happy. You never asked if I was doing what I loved. You only wanted to know if I was stable enough not to embarrass you." His shoulders dropped, and for the first time he didn't try to spin it. "You raised me better than this," he said quietly. "I don't know when I forgot." I looked at him, beyond the perfect haircut, the cufflinks, the practiced charm. "Oh, I know when," I replied. Outside the room, the hum of service had grown louder. Dishes clinked. Someone in the kitchen shouted an order. Danielle's laughter floated from the pass. Daniel looked toward the hallway, toward the movement and the sound he no longer had access to, and then back at me. "I want to fix this," he said. I didn't respond. I stood, reached for my bourbon and took one final sip. Then I nodded toward the door. "Mark will walk you out," I said softly. "We have work to do." He hesitated, then turned and left, his footsteps soft against the floor. I didn't watch him go. I turned toward the kitchen instead, toward the warmth. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream paper with ornate gold lettering embossed on the surface. I opened it slowly, not out of curiosity but out of caution. Inside was an invitation to Sophie's next charity gala, complete with dress code, ballet instructions, and a breakdown of donation tiers. Behind it, a sticky note in Daniel's handwriting. "Maybe you'd consider handling the catering. They'd be lucky to have you." I let out a small laugh. Not cruel, not mocking, just the kind that escapes when something no longer hurts. I set the card aside on the counter and returned to my tea, the steam curling around the rim like punctuation. That afternoon, Danielle came in through the back office door with rolled-up blueprints under her arm and a smile spreading across her face. "I found it," she said, unrolling the plans across the prep table. "Downtown Merida. Large windows, high ceilings. The back room already has piping for a second line. It needs work, but it has foundations. We leaned over the drawings together, tracing walls with our fingertips, discussing flow, imagining guests walking in for the first time. A second restaurant, I said. This time in Merida. Different city, same heart. This one's ours from the ground up, I added firmly. She nodded. And room upstairs for the mentorship program. Maybe even a teaching kitchen. We took 2 glasses of kava from the fridge and sat side by side with the plans between us. To the next table, she said. To the next table, I repeated, clinking my glass against hers. That night, as the restaurant filled with the soft rhythm of service, forks against porcelain, low conversations, the synchronized heartbeat of a kitchen in motion, I sat at my usual table by the window. The invitation still lay beside me, unopened since morning. I watched Mirabelle adjust the candles at table 6, Mark helping an elderly couple find their coats, Cesar changing the jazz playlist to something warmer for the late diners. I picked up the envelope once more, considered it, then slid it gently into the drawer beside me and closed it with finality. I had other things to answer to. The new sign went up just before sunset. Caroline and Danielle, carved in brushed copper, caught the light like something alive. I stood across the street with Danielle, neither of us speaking for a long moment. We didn't need to. The weight of all the years, the risk, the grit, sat quietly in our chests. Opening night felt different this time. There was no rush, no attempt to prove we belonged here. The staff moved with calm precision, confident in the space we'd built. The dining room glowed. Tall windows framed the soft southern dusk, and every table carried something we believed in. I stood near the entrance, glass in hand, and tapped a spoon gently against its rim. The gentle murmur of the room faded. I won't talk much, I said, but I do want to say this. This isn't a restaurant born from money. It's born from voice. From listening to that small, quiet truth inside you that refuses to give up, even when everyone around you does. I let the words land. Around the room, people raised their glasses. Regulars from Guadalajara, students from the mentorship program, friends who'd carried trays and dreams alongside me since the beginning. Daniel's flowers had arrived earlier, elegant lilies and pale blue thistles. The card was simple, proud of you. E. I left them on the reception counter. Sophie hadn't sent anything. I hadn't expected her to. Later I walked slowly through the dining room, pausing at each table. Not as a guest, not even as a host, but as the woman who once searched Mercado Libre for second-hand pots and learned Excel at midnight with calloused fingers and bad coffee. Danielle joined me near the archway beneath the main chandelier. Above us, the sign gleamed in copper and pride. Her name and mine equal earned. How does it feel? She asked. I watched a young waiter adjust a guest's chair before they even asked. Someone laughed at the back table. The kitchen doors swung open with the rhythm of a heartbeat that knew exactly what it was doing. It's no longer about proving they were wrong, I said, breathing in air that smelled of rosemary and new beginnings. It's about proving I was right.